if it is not true that a human agent, when faced with a choice between mutually incompatible actions, is at least on some occasions able and capable to perform each of them, then the bad consequences of his choice are never his own fault. That is, he is then never to blame for them. This is the culpability problem. In his book, Thinking About Free Will, Peter van Inwagen connects two plausible theses about what we usually call free will. The first plausible thesis is that we human agents, when faced with a choice between mutually incompatible actions, are at least on some occasions able and capable to perform each of them. And the second plausible thesis is that if the consequences of any action are to be attributed to an agent who decided to perform that action, there have to be occasions in which that agent was able and capable to perform each of the actions between which he was trying to decide. That is, the first thesis is then not only plausibly true, but simply true. It is my firm conviction that it is right to assume such a connection between these two theses. However, by invoking additional theses, van Inwagen goes on to describe a dialectical or even dilemma situation that has received special attention in the contemporary debate. These additional theses are, first, two theses about the concepts of determinism and indeterminism, where indeterminism is the negation of determinism and both form an exclusive contradiction. This is sentence 3. Determinism is the thesis that the past and the laws of nature determine a unique future. And 4, the negation of that, indeterminism is the thesis that the past and the laws of nature do not determine a unique future. These additional theses are, second thesis concerning these two famous arguments, according to which the first thesis, that we are on some occasions able and capable to perform each of the actions, can neither be true if determinism is the case, nor be true if indeterminism, that is, the negation of determinism, is the case. However, a sentence that is incompatible with both members of an exclusive contradiction is impossibly true, and therefore false. The two famous and much discussed arguments that are part of van Inwagen's aforementioned thesis are, on the one hand, as he said before, the so-called consequence argument, according to which, if determinism is true, my actions are always logical consequences of inevitable conditions in the remote past, together with equally inevitable laws of nature, such that what I decide is not free, but also inevitable. And the so-called mind argument, according to which, if my decision were undetermined, my action would not be the result of a controlled and free decision, but a mere matter of chance. The dilemma, therefore, is the following. Our main thesis 1, about our controlled ability to choose among at least two mutually incompatible actions, has to be false, if none of the two arguments is refutable on plausible grounds. In what follows, I will not attack directly one of van Inwagen's unanswerable arguments, the consequence argument and the mind argument. Instead, I will focus on the distinction between determinism and indeterminism, as van Inwagen understands it. And I will raise the question whether there are forms of determinism and indeterminism that might not be strictly contradictory. For if there are forms of determinism and indeterminism that might not be strictly contradictory, it follows that a thesis, even if it appears to be incompatible both with determinism and indeterminism, might itself well be true. Let me use one of van Inwagen's remarks about his distinction between determinism and indeterminism as a starting point. And this is, quote, "There are seemingly unanswerable arguments that demonstrate that thesis 1 is incompatible with determinism. I allude, of course, to the various versions of the consequence argument as it is known in the trade. And there are seemingly unanswerable arguments that demonstrate that thesis 1 is incompatible with indeterminism. This part needs a little work, since indeterminism does not imply that a given person's actions are undetermined. The work can be done." End of quote. Van Inwagen has on numerous occasions already done this little additional work for the case of indeterminism. That is, he has described a form of indeterminism that applies to the decision to act of a given person at a given time. I shall now turn to one of these descriptions that can be found in the article A Promising Argument in this collection aforementioned, Thinking About Free Will. However, let me first suggest to call indeterminism as applied to the actions of a given person personally localized indeterminism, and to call determinism as not applied to a person through additional work, general determinism. My guiding question is whether, even granted that determinism and indeterminism as quoted above are contradictory, there is a form of general determinism that does not contradict a personally localized indeterminism as described by van Inwagen. In general, my aim is to find a form of determinism that is weak enough to not exclude a personally localized indeterminism, and that is therefore weak enough to escape the unanswerable consequence argument, but that, on the other hand, is strong enough to escape, in a way, the mind argument, according to which it seems that in the case of a personal localized indeterminism, a person's decisions has to be a mere matter of chance. Let me now turn to the little work that van Inwagen has already done in virtue of which indeterminism gets applicable to the actions of a given person in a given situation of choice. And this is described at the beginning of his A Promising Argument. I quote, "Let us say that it is at a certain moment up to one whether one will do A or do B, if one is then faced with a choice between doing A and doing B, and one is then able to do A and is then able to do B." Thus, according to this first sentence of A Promising Argument, van Inwagen assumes two things with respect to an upcoming decision. First, he assumes that it is only up to the human agent what action he is going to perform, being up to one whether one will do A or do B. Second, he assumes that the human agent is able and capable to perform each of the incompatible actions, ability in the relevant sense to do each of them. The difficulty that van Inwagen goes on to describe lies in the fact that, according to him, the first element, that means being up to one whether one will do A or B, entails personally localized indeterminism, a thesis van Inwagen calls incompatibilism. And I quote, "Incompatibilism, in the sense of van Inwagen's, if one is at a certain moment faced with a choice between doing A and doing B, it is then up to one whether one will do A or do B, only if it is then undetermined whether one will do A or do B, and necessarily so. End of quote. However, however, one and the same personally localized indeterminism, according to van Inwagen's indetermination principle, appears to exclude the second element of decision competence, which is being able and capable to do both actions between which one have to decide. I quote this new indetermination inability principle, where T2 is a future moment and T1 is a future moment earlier than T2. If one is now faced with a choice between doing A at T2 and doing B at T2, and if at T1 it will be undetermined whether one will do A at T2 or do B at T2, and if this would then be undetermined, whatever one might do between now and T1, then one is not now able to do A at T2, and one is not now able to do B at T2. Hence, according to van Inwagen, a decision competence that is allegedly free and justifies culpability imposes incompatible requirements, and is therefore, as the article tries to demonstrate, impossible. Before a human agent decides what to do, it has to be undetermined what he is going to do. If his decision between mutually incompatible actions is supposed to be only up to him, however, he cannot be able and capable in the relevant sense to perform the actions in question before he decides, if it is at that time undetermined what he is going to do. What is then to be done for us? Let us first consider what, according to van Inwagen, is required for the truth of personally localized indeterminism. Again, a quote, "Let us say that it is at a certain moment undetermined whether one will do A or do B, if there is a possible world in which the laws of nature are the same as those of the actual world, and whose state at the moment is identical with the state of the actual world at that moment, and in which one will do A, and a world satisfying those same two conditions in which one will do B." So there are three things we need for personally localized indeterminism. There has to be an actual world in which a decision is upcoming at a given time. Let us call this world temporal choice world, or TC world. Further, there have to be at least two possible worlds that are congruent with the TC world up to that time, and that from this time on differ from one another without contradicting their own past, congruent with the TC world. I call them the possible A world and the possible B world. And finally, in both of these possible worlds, there have to be laws of nature that are the same in the A world and in the B world, and that are, moreover, in accordance with the laws of nature of the TC world. Let us first consider the at least two possible worlds with the same past that, according to van Inwagen, have to be assumed given personally localized indeterminism. It seems plain to me, given the above-mentioned conditions for a personally localized indeterminism, that the TC world has to be identical with a possible world, but that at a time prior to the decision, it is undetermined in the sense of van Inwagen's definition of indeterminism, to which one of these possible worlds the TC world is identical. For given personally localized indeterminism, this depends on how the human agent is going to decide. If she decides to perform action A, the TC world is identical to the possible A world. If she decides to perform action B, the TC world is identical to the possible B world. It is therefore undetermined whether the TC world is the possible A world or the possible B world. But is it at least not undetermined that the TC world is either the possible A world or the possible B world? That is it true that the TC world is the possible B world if it is not the possible A world, and that it is the possible A world if it is not the possible B world? It seems to me that this doesn't follow, at least as long as personally localized indeterminism, as described by van Inwergen, is in place. For as things presently stand at the TC world, nothing excludes that the TC world is the possible A world. Further, nothing excludes that the TC world is the possible B world. Consequently, nothing excludes that it is not the possible A world, and likewise nothing excludes that it is not the possible B world. In fact, the TC world might, as things stand prior to the decision, neither be the possible A world nor the possible B world, and instead a different possible world depending on how someone would decide in a situation of personally localized indeterminism. In fact, van Inwergen appears to admit in a footnote that when an agent called Sally is trying to decide in a situation of personally localized indeterminism, there might be much more possibilities than only the possibilities that the agent is taking into account in his decision. Therefore, much more possible worlds might be compatible with the past of the TC world than only the A world and the B world. It follows that even after an agent would have excluded one of the alternative causes of actions, A or B, in the course of deliberation, there might still be an indeterminacy, which with respect to a whole range of alternative causes of actions. We are entitled to assume, however, that when it comes to a decision between A and B, personally localized indeterminism is more closely focused on alternative causes of action that have not been excluded than on alternative causes of actions that have been excluded. It makes a difference for Sally's decision-making whether she contrasts all possibilities that come in question only with the possibility to become a physician, or whether she contrasts them with all possibilities she wavered between before eventually excluding one of them. If it is legitimate to assume something along these lines without contradicting the conditions of personally localized indeterminism, it implies that excluding alternative causes of action according to certain principles narrows the range of remaining options. These remaining options are then, according to that principles, despite of a personal localized indeterminacy of choice as a whole, closer to the choice of the agent than other options, which has been excluded. That is, the possible worlds that, according to personally localized indeterminism, have to be compatible with the TC world might have different degrees of closeness with respect to an agent at a certain time in the actual world, without thereby contradicting the conditions of personally localized indeterminism. David Lewis has famously described this difference of closeness or nearness between possible worlds as degrees or degree of similarity between possible worlds, and he has tried to defend it against the charge of obscureness in his counterfactuals. Building on this concept of degrees of similarity, he has in turn developed a concept of comparative possibility. In what follows, I feel inspired by this concept of Lewis without having the opportunity to discuss it further at that time. However, it seems to be evident with this concept in mind that it is not the case that the two or more possible worlds that have to be possible continuations of a decision between alternative courses of actions in the TC world, according to van Inwagen's conditions for this indeterminism, have to be equally possible worlds with respect to the locality of personally localized indeterminism, that is, with respect to the person and the time at which she is faced with a choice. Instead, they might have different degrees of possibility and therefore different degrees of closeness or nearness with respect to their connection to the TC world. As the foregoing reasoning has shown, somebody who is faced with a choice between explicit alternative courses of actions in a situation of personally localized indeterminism might well retain a whole range of different and mutually incompatible courses of action, such that even if personally localized indeterminism holds, it is up to her which of them she is going to pursue, and this even after she has excluded one of the alternative courses of action between she has to decide. In fact, that a human agent in the course of decision making excludes just one out of several possibilities does not imply that she has also decided what she is going to do instead. She rather has to decide, in addition, for a certain action with a range of remaining possible actions. I want to maintain, however, that depending on which exclusion has been carried out, the range of possible actions may be more closely focused on the remaining possibility A or more closely focused on the remaining possibility B, without thereby contradicting the conditions of the originally assumed personally localized indeterminism. If it is admitted that when a human agent is faced with a choice in a situation of personally localized indeterminism, some of all alternative courses of action that come into question might be closer to the choice of the agent than other of these alternative courses of action, without thereby contradicting the conditions of this form of indeterminism, then it must also be admitted that only one of these alternative courses of action might, according to certain principles, be closer to the choice of the agent than any other of these alternative courses of action, and this depending on which exclusions the agent carries out. We may say that such a course of action is, according, for instance, to rational principles of decision, the most possible course of action for a certain agent. So I had a part about Thomas Aquinas, which I will skip on reasons of time, which is similar constructed to the proposal of van Inwagen's. And I come now to my conclusions on this. This brings me to the second condition of personally localized indeterminism according to van Inwagen, that is, to the question whether it is consistent, in my view, if exactly one world among many possible continuations of the TC world may be the most possible according to rational principles for a person that has to make a decision, that at least two of the possible worlds that are possible continuations of a decision that was made in a situation of personally localized indeterminism in the TC world, the A world and the B world, may have the same laws of nature as the TC world. I think that this requirement can be also fulfilled if it is denied that a past state of the world, together with the conjunction of all laws of nature, entails every other state of the world. As we have seen at the beginning, this thesis is equivalent to the thesis of nomological determinism as defined by van Inwagen. The thesis that everything that takes place follows entirely from an arbitrary state of the past, solely together with the laws of nature, even though, in my view, nothing that ever happens is a contradiction to the laws of nature. Or, as one might say, violates a law of nature, it does not follow, assuming a past state, that it is implied solely by a law of nature. Instead, there might be other rules or other true generalizations without exception, according to which something in the world occurs or happens, other principles, that is to say, that are not laws of nature. According to personally localized indeterminism, as van Inwerken describes it, a controlled decision has to be indeterminate at a time before that decision only with respect to facts of the past and laws of nature of the TC world. This is obviously consistent with a general determinism in a weaker sense, according to which that decision is determined with respect to all relevant principles of the future decision-making progress. These principles, however, need neither be facts of the past nor laws of nature, nor need they be unavoidable for the agent that is about to make that decision. It is not unavoidable for me that I regard something as good or right according to certain principles, what according to other principles is something regarded as bad or wrong. The general logical determinism that I want to propose as possible is the thesis that the future is determined by all principles that, starting from a certain past state of the world, play a part in the proceeding of the history of the world. In my view, the principles that play a role in the thesis of such a general or logical determinism need not be laws of nature. True generalizations that are not laws of nature might differ among worlds with the same past and the same laws of nature as the TC world. And there might be exactly one of those worlds in which these true generalizations are, all things considered, maximally rational and favorable for all human and other rational beings that have to make decisions and conform to thesis 1 of the culpability problem. According, for instance, to Leibniz, such a possible world would not only be the best of all possible worlds, but also identical to the actual world, in which a rational determinism is consistently conceivable with the culpability of persons that make rational decisions, at least according to Leibniz. It seems, therefore, that the conditions of a personally localized indeterminism, as van Inwerken specifies it, can be combined with a weak determinism that includes rational principles of decision or other true generalizations that are up to us. For these rational principles might be consistent with the same laws of nature, regardless of which alternative course of action is pursued. Thus, it seems to me that we can claim in general, without contradicting ourselves, that at a certain time T1 in the TC world, personally localized indeterminism holds, and there are more than one alternative courses of action, that means more than one possible continuations of the present, that are all up to the agent that is about to make a decision. And this, even though only one of these alternative courses of action is the most possible for the person in question according to rational principles of decision. And that, further, a rational person might be able and capable, due to a deliberation or concilium according to rational principles that begins after T1, to determine the most convenient course of action, that is, the course of action that, according to such a concilium, appears to be the most advisable. If it is legitimate to uphold the thesis that all worlds in the situation of personally localized indeterminism that are subject to a decision of a person are possible, but only one of them is rationally the most possible for the person according to rational principles of decision-making, then a weak form of general and logical, that is neither temporally nor personally specified determinism, might hold. If we consider all principles rational as well as non-rational, that are relevant for what will take place. If so, there is no reason to believe that a person that makes a rational decision should not prefer the most possible world according to rational principles, and this even if God repeatedly causes the TC world to revert to the time of decision. How then can we reconcile a general determinism in the weak sense as indicated above with the two required elements being up to one, whether one will do A or B, on the one hand, and being able to do A and able to do B at the time of decision on the other hand? For according to van Inwagen, these elements could not both be true, given that the first element implies personally localized indeterminism, and given that personally localized indeterminism is incompatible with the second element, that is, with the ability to perform each of the incompatible courses of action. Following my proposal, we can hold with respect to the first element that exactly one course of action depends only on a rational, self-determined decision of the agent, and is therefore a fortiori up to him under conditions of personally localized indeterminism, namely the course of action that, due to the exerted concilium, is the most possible for the agent according to rational principles. And this holds while the other alternative courses of action do not only depend on the agent, but are influenced by factors that are outside of his control. Thus, we can say, in this sense, that it is up to one whether one will perform that course of action that conforms to the possible world that is most possible according to rational principles. If it is only up to him whether he will choose the action that conforms to the possible world that is most possible according to rational principles, then it is also only up to him whether he will not choose the action that conforms to the possible world that is most possible according to rational principles. Taking it all together, it is up to him whether he will choose the action in question or an alternative course of action. With respect to the second required element, namely being able in the relevant sense to perform each of the alternative actions, there is no reason to believe that in a situation of personally localized indeterminism there can be no ability in the relevant sense. In fact, the only reason van Inwagen cites in favor of his view is that a person sufficiently informed about the problem of indeterminacy of decision could not be sure before his decision how he or she is going to decide. As van Inwagen argues, such a person is, if faced with a decision, e.g. with a decision between keeping silent about the transgression of a friend in a public consultation or not, could not promise with certainty to do something. However, it should be obvious by now that if we assume that the conditions of personally localized indeterminism may hold together with the weak form of determinism that I have described, namely that one of these alternative decisions conforms to the possible world that is most possible according to rational principles, I could therefore now be sure that if I stick to the rational principles of my decision, I will do what in that situation is the most possible according to rational principles. Therefore, I can legitimately be sure that I am able, in the relevant sense, to keep silent, and that I am therefore in a position to make such a promise in advance. All perfect duplicates of me placed in a perfect duplicate of my present situation would, to 100%, always make the same decision according to the same principles, whatever the decision may be. If so, however, there is no reason to exclude the possibility that before making a decision, one and the same person may be able to perform each of the alternative actions between which he or she is trying to decide in a culpable way.